Chapter 8. Cameron's final meeting with Mr. Tiberias. That night, Cameron fell into a deep, nourishing sleep that rendered him fully unconscious. He had taken the medicine again, but had noticed right away that something did not feel right. Rather than feeling his brain activity gradually shutting down, he instead felt himself being transported into a spinning, oscillating orb that was being flung around violently throughout what looked like the night sky, but was a dark space provided by a large backdrop with cut-out paper made to look like stars, much akin to a film studio or a set, maybe one from the 1930s or 40s. Suddenly, he landed in deep water at the bottom of this great darkness and sunk deep below. At first, he only felt, but could not see himself, contained within this orb. He sensed the presence of beasts in the water. When he slowly regained vision, he discovered them to be cryptid, half-men, half-fish creatures that encircled him. He had no control over where he could go, so he only shielding himself with his arms. But then it seemed that he had no arms, and his mind was transmuted fully into this orb. Finally, he flew over the depths of the ocean and shot back up to land, squarely into the big valley of verdant green pastures. The cloud of dust around him subsided, and he saw the figures of 4 men in bright robes with stark white curly hair approaching him. They resembled ancient kings or priests of some kind of higher order. They knocked on the orb, and Cameron felt the thud of their fists. Out of nowhere, he heard and felt a quake rile up the whole land. There was a great city shielded by a high wall. This wall was made of gold bricks that glimmered in the sunlight. From a considerable distance, Cameron could see the men peer over this immense wall, prepare their spears for an approaching onslaught. Suddenly, hordes of men assailed the city, throwing spears and catapulting projects into the wall. Before they could continue their siege, a large crack in the earth opened up and swallowed up all the assailants and crushed them under a fearful lump of rocks. The people confined within the city walls cheered at their apparent victory and promptly held an extensive parade celebrating it. Eventually, after what felt like a millennium, Cameron witnessed the city engulfed in flames. But it wasn't from enemy forces, but from among their own ranks that someone had thrown a torch on the wooden thatched homes that were ablaze within minutes. All that was left was a pitiful plume of smoke. The 4 figures stood amidst the flames, completely impervious to it, and appeared to radiate luminously among the darkness surrounding them. Following this, they picked up the orb itself, encapsulated it in a large casket, and brought it with them on an extensive trek in which they mounted large palanquins supported by what looked to be human figures who were all the same height and build, with uniform jumpsuits and masks that floated directly over the land with such ease that Cameron scarcely felt the commotion. In fact, the rest of the journey remained silent, and he only saw the ground below him. He noticed what looked to be earth, but all the land was one large continent, free of barriers, and every section of it was bright, luscious green, bereft of pestilence and disease, though he could only garner that idea from his intuition. It was a fantastic sight that he could hardly fathom. The sun appeared to be not one solid shape, but a gradation of even light dispersed throughout the area. The saintly-looking men looked down from time to time, but it was difficult to see their countenance as they were shrouded in mist, through glowing fuchsia with passion. After some time flying above the waters, they spotted a peninsula from afar, and spoke among themselves, and when they consulted with each other, they did not speak an earthly language or any recognizable tongue. Instead, they simply gazed into one another's eyes and knew intuitively what the other was communicating. There seemed to be no contention or ego among these people. They had never once bickered or even uttered a word in malice. At last, they signaled for the vessel to stop, and it landed gracefully in the green pastures. After some more time consulting among themselves and seeming to reach a kind of mutual agreement, all of them turned around, and the one with the velvet crown and curly locks of silver hair laid their hands on the orb. Cameron felt a considerable aura of energy passing to him. At this point, after some hazy assessment of what had been transpiring around him, Cameron was transformed back into human form in the same area. The 4 men vanished and were never seen again. Around him, he saw a giant bush with a cloud of smoke coming from it. He waited to see if anything would come out of it, or perhaps from behind it, but he waited in vain. Settling on approaching its source out of curiosity, Cameron drew gradually closer. All of a sudden, he heard the voice that was parroting the tunes to a well-known British Grenadiers march. He smelled the distinct, moderately stinging accompanying perfume of a tobacco pipe and the tangy hints of schnapps, concluded that it could only come from one person. "Hello?" Cameron shouted, his voice echoing into the wide expanses around him. Nobody answered. He moved closer and closer. A faint cackle was heard. "Who's there?" He shouted even louder, but to no avail. Cameron tried again to move toward the bush, which seemed to keep getting further away the closer he got. Finally, after several attempts, he was able to grasp its thistles and branches, finding it to be home to a large grapevine. The smoke, he discovered, was deriving from a small fireplace, which was still lit but rapidly fading out. Aside from the bush and fire, there was a set of stone slabs, 4 steps, which led up to the 10 paces or so above an incline. Cameron hesitatingly followed them up, only to find another set of stairs, which in turn led past a steep hill to another one, and this process repeated about a dozen times. Finally, he arrived at the final set of stairs, but it was steep, like a mine step, and he almost fell. The ground around him became increasingly steep and jagged. He held on to the tree branch for balance, but it broke off, and he almost came slipping off the cliff face into the ocean below. Fortunately, there was one tree stump that he grasped onto for dear life. It all felt so real, the adrenaline flowing through his veins, the perspiration dripping from his face, the muscles tensing up, and of course, his heart pounding rapidly. He held on for what seemed like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Out of nowhere, a hand popped from behind the peak of the cliff, moved closer to Cameron. Cameron tugged at the arm of the mysterious aide, which drew him back to safety with astounding strength. At last, he was safe. Before Cameron could see through the glint of the sunlight, he again heard that familiar, puerile chortle. Mr. Tiberias was standing in front of him with his hands on his hips, apparently catching his breath. He was not wearing his typical outfit of flamboyant Regency colors, but rather a simple tweed traveling jacket, hemp blouse, and a colonial-style buckled shoes that were scuffed and worn. "Well, look who we have to join us today," Mr. Tiberias began with a soft hum in his voice. "A familiar face. I thought we never crossed paths again, but I suppose, as fate has it, we are inseparable. I see you located my summer home. How did you manage to do that? I thought no one would ever find me all the way out here. I admire your persistence. You're quite the sleuth. You must really require my help this time." "Wrong," Cameron responded agitatedly. "I don't want your help at all. I didn't come here on my own volition. This is a nightmare. I have no choice in what my mind decides to spin up every time I close my eyes. You're one example. The persistent, agonizing, fiendish product of my delirious imagination." "Is that what your beloved Dr. Eakins told you?" Mr. Tiberias retorted with a wild gesticulation. "Ha! Spouting out cliches, Dickens references. He thought that by pumping you full of medicine that he would pry me away from you. You and I are practically joined at the hip. He really isn't an expert after all. What kind of professional medical advice is that after all? You think that you can just pop some magic pill and have me disappear like a night owl at the crack of dawn? I'm no such thing. I'm no ghost. I'm simply a composite of all that you deny and repudiate with every breath until there's none left. Do you still want to know the answers after all I've so willingly revealed to you? I come from wealth, but nobody truly knows my origins. I sometimes stay in a sewer only because I was once banished from the delicacies of normal life. But since you've extended my leash, I've been enjoying this escape home tucked away in the valleys. Now, since the process is almost done, I should be able to come to you directly without inhibition. You see, the last time I visited, I lost a privilege. I had to give up my sense of smell and taste. Oh, the bloody olfactory is gone forever. Do you know how miserable it is never to smell a rose again? To add to that, Mr. Spencer had to stay in the sewer all by himself. Well, that's not much of a loss. He would have complained incessantly anyway. Even with this luscious, fruitful garden around him, he would pick out sour grapes on purpose because he's incapable of finding the resplendent bounty around him. Where I see satisfaction, he sees despondency. But my sense of smell will be sorely missed. It's no matter. It wasn't my most prized sense anyway, fortunately. But the devil take the whole idea of it. The arbitrary seizing of one's sanity piece by piece. No longer can I enjoy those remarkable, wistful Proustian moments. I can still read, though. God bless them for not taking my eyesight. I don't know what I'd do without that. It's my most treasured asset. Without it, I'd be lost. And certainly you did have a choice coming here. Deep down, you knew the job was not complete. Therefore, you felt empty and uninitiated. In your weakest of weakest moments, you came back. Whether you think you did deliberately or not matters not. What counts is that you're here. Welcome back. Mr. Tiberias spoke with manic enthusiasm and danced around with equal feeling. I don't understand what's going on. All I know is that you're not real and not meant to be taken seriously. I don't care how particular and arcane you come off as. You're still a figment of my imagination, an abstraction, an illusion. I don't care if you offered vaguely helpful spells packaged up in a confusing bundle of false pretenses. I don't care if, according to you, I was the one who actually wanted to come here, not you, because of my unconscious battling with a conscious will. I just don't care about any of it. You shouldn't even be here, wherever this is, and I don't want any of your help. You shouldn't be poking your freakish head into my daily life either, Cameron said irately, waving his finger in his face in a manner so obviously enraged that he seemed to startle Mr. Tiberias, who looked somewhat hurt by the comments. I don't blame you for not taking me seriously, sybarite cad that I am, but I beg your pardon about me being an illusion. Strong, scientific textbook terms you've been tossing at me. Have you been reading Freud and Adler? Congratulations, you have me pinned down. I am your ego and id embodied in raw form, and here to take the splendors of victory. It is mine for the taking. I take precedence over your mind. You seem to give me no thought in your day-to-day life, and I swear that I'm a mere projection. But at the very same time, you can't get me out of your head. Am I that alluring? Am I really that unforgettable? I'm flattered, Mr. Tiberias proclaimed this so vigorously that he nearly spat. All I want for you is to stay out of my life. I don't want you in my business, and especially near Cecil. If you touch her, you'll regret it, Cameron warned him. Suddenly, Mr. Tiberias broke into an all-consuming, effervescent burst of laughter that lasted almost a full minute. Oh, I'm just reeling over laughing at you. You're so predictable. Why would I ever be compelled to do such a thing? Is it because when you supposedly talked to her so self-assuredly, it was really only me speaking through you? Ha ha! I can't just waltz into your life and do that. I need permission first. Silly. Even if I did, the prospect of me stealing your life is preposterous. Which is why my laughter is befitting. Oh, I'm so sorry for sounding tactless. I really do wish I could be of some help. Mr. Tiberias calmed himself down, took out a handkerchief, wiped his tears of laughter with it, although it almost seemed to be for effect, as he did not have tear ducts, at least any that Cameron could see. Listen, I'm sorry for reacting the way I did, Cameron began, wiping his forehead of the sweat which had begun to stick insistently. I do appreciate your advice, but I can't risk you compromising my life, so I have to set up some parameters. You have my word, Mr. Tiberias declared. I promise to keep out of your life, but I cannot guarantee that something out of my control might happen, something awry, though I give my word that nothing untoward will occur under my own due supervision. Now that the doors have opened, so to speak, I must compose myself in a fashion that is consistent with the staging of reality. I don't understand. What do you mean by the doors have opened and staging of reality? Cameron asked perplexedly, noticeably worried about the way Mr. Tiberias worded himself. It's not quite the time to figure these things out. Trust me. Those that beckon me here have given me a set of rules to live by. When you arrived here, by way of that peculiar orb, that was the undercurrents of your own subconscious that conjured those up. I had nothing to do with it. Now both sides are partway fused, we must complete the pathway by finishing the task of melding the two worlds into one. If the process is left unfinished, one world will consume the other in a constant state of entanglement. But if we can manage to rein it in smoothly and have them subsume each other gradually, we will fare just well. Tread lightly. Mr. Tiberias spoke with surprising deliberateness, marking his words prudently. Partway fused? How is any of this happening? This doesn't make any sense. I had no idea this was even going on. Cameron tugged at his hair, feeling more stressed than ever. Well, you should have known. You're the one who helped me open it up, silly. But your insistence on conjuring me up when you most needed a clue, but you wouldn't know. You're too blind to see what's directly in front of you. You were too concerned with what that Mr. Singer thought of you, what your cohort said, and your reputation, and not enough about this process and how it's playing out. Now to your detriment. But don't worry. Nobody will lose anything. At worst, this world of fancy will collide with reality, and some leftover vestiges of one will subsist, and continue to interact vaguely with those of the material world. But they will appear only as frail shadows or ambiguous reflections of those in the surface of the water, nothing more. People will scarcely believe that they're real. I still don't understand why I had to be dragged into this, said Cameron dejectedly. Listen, friend, it was you who dragged yourself into this, whether you prefer to think of it that way or not. What is true is that you have initially sought answers. You originally deigned to venture into this capricious, unpredictable world, one marked by suspension of all logic and reason, yet I offered you solace amid the turmoil in your own life. Even though you don't see this as a tenable future, you followed this rabbit hole with your mind open and your spirit free, open to whatever whims it decided to leave you into. Ultimately, you trusted just enough for me to gain certain privileges. A little least leavens a whole batch of dough. I had nothing to do with your current state. If I could shield you from all harm, I would. But I'm not that malevolent. Besides, what are you so afraid of? The chaotic joining of these two worlds means perfect mayhem, when all order, planetary motion, and the entirety of the cosmos is wrought with disarray. The new life and spectacles of the future will spawn forth from the ash heap of this old world. These are the ashramas that the Hindus spoke of in the Vedas. This is exactly the kind of thrill that I thirst after. It is essential. Out of nowhere, the sound of cracking emerged from a nearby thicket. After some struggle, something arose from it, strode into full sight. It was a hefty, fearsome, living, breathing creature that appeared to be in the shape of a large mouth with two immense, almost swollen lips conjoined, one on top of the other. Like Mr. Spencer, it had its own set of eyes, which were bright azure, a set of thin, tubular legs, tiny arms, and a stubby nose. But most of its body was taken up by the extent of its lips. It was mostly pink in color, but a blue hue was visible in the corners of its mouth. In stark contrast to its thin legs, a massive gut obtruded from above the waist and hung out repulsively. On its head lay a small tuft of greasy black hair, which was part down the middle, and on top of it had a formidable, bushy mustache under the brim of its lips. It started yawning, or doing what looked to be a yawn, by expanding and contracting its fierce lips toward and away from each other. It would have been an impressive sight if it weren't for the outlandish, terrifying notion of the entire ordeal. Ah, Mr. Hollander, my good friend from out west, what a serendipitous delight it is for you to join us. How does gin and cognac sound to you? How about some buttered toddy? I'll put it on your tab. The last time you drank from my collection of spirits, you consumed nearly the whole row of brandies that I had stowed away for the winter, and you still have both the nimbleness and gall to perform acrobatics in the courtyard. What a tease you are. Mr. Hollander wiped away some bile that had formed under his glowering eyes, and responded in a low, measured intonation that resonated so much that the ground quivered. It's about time somebody drank out of that cupboard that you keep hidden away for decades on end. I was doing you a favor. A man such as yourself can't be trusted with all that alcohol, he stated as he fetched a pair of bifocals from his left chest pocket and donned them impatiently. I suppose you have a point there, responded Mr. Tiberias. At least I drink with responsibility. Too much gin will cloud one's head and intellect. It only makes those judgments and ideas once so clear become obfuscated. Only a little drink from me this time, old bard. You should have brought your croquet kit. It's been too long since I've properly stretched my legs in this lawn and had a good game. I'd consider playing if you didn't explode in anger every time you lost, Mr. Hollander exclaimed, carelessly flaying spit in every direction. Well, that's simply because you don't play an honest game. My anger is completely valid. One cannot play with a cheetah. They'll drag you down every chance you get. Excuse me, Cameron interjected. What is the relevance of any of this? What is the relevance of it? Shouted Mr. Hollander so irately that he grew red and slammed his fist. We're simply two men shooting the breeze with each other and playing catch-up. Who the hell cares if it has any relevance to you, you nosy, meddling bastard? Keep out of it. It's none of your business if it pertains to you. The nerve of some people. He adopted a pose of sadistic pride and snickered to himself when he referred to Cameron as a bastard. Calm down, my good Mr. Hollander. Do not be so seduced by pathos. I apologize for his behavior, said Mr. Tiberias, turning to Cameron, as if Mr. Hollander was some kind of strange feral animal. He can get really sensitive about certain topics being brought up, and to think he hadn't even had a trip to drink yet. He is known for his monstrously swift temper. Think of a hefty-sized baby who requires constant napping. He'll get over himself, right? He now turned to Mr. Hollander, who calmed down a little, but evidently did not like being described as a hefty-sized baby. At this point, Mr. Tiberias theatrically motioned everyone into his summer home through a minuscule single oak door with one equally tiny porthole window in the center. It was obvious it was tailor-made for Mr. Tiberias and Mr. Hollander, but Cameron bumped his head on the top frame of it. Inside, they were met with a surprisingly ample lobby, which looked considerably larger than one would expect from the exterior. "If it makes us all a little bit less prudish, then yes, I'll calm down. I apologize for my behavior," he grunted apparently sincerely to Cameron. "I am known for my passions as much as I'm known for my folly. It won't happen again. Well, what are we waiting for? Let's fetch the wine." And with this declaration, Mr. Tiberias gladly led everyone from his lobby into the cellar, where a number of old wines were stored. He opened up a case and dusted one off. "A 1798 Ron Valley Red," he said proudly. Promptly they began to set out some chinaware, appetizers, and of course, a host of various drinks. What followed was a vivacious celebration of sorts that had lasted for over 2 hours. Or that's what was signified by the grandfather clock above the mantelpiece. They began feasting on a series of sardine canapes, though Cameron was understandably abstemious and refrained from partaking. In between voracious bites, Mr. Hollander proudly said, "What a pleasure it is to be acquainted more with food and drink than I am with men. I pity those who are more familiar with people or books than they are with the riches of a good brioche. Never has food done me any harm, I swear by it. Friends have failed me where food has only satisfied." Shortly after this giddy confession, he stuffed his face with a host of desserts and gulped down innumerable glasses of wine. However, the contents of the food and the drink seemed to drain out on the other side of Mr. Hollander's lip-shaped body through another hole visible, offering egress of said food. Mr. Tiberias, on the other hand, ate with no such privileges, evidently having to relieve himself in a matter so private that it required the water closet all to himself. Revolted by this shameless display of gluttony, Cameron opted not to speak most of the time. Besides, he thought, what other cruel tricks could there be involved with such delicacies offered by these relentlessly confusing aberrations of men? "Slow down, Hollander. Just because your mouth is thrice as big as everyone else's doesn't mean you should be its slave and follow it everywhere it decides to go," Mr. Tiberias warned him, but it was no use. He, too, was inebriated, and he was already quite a stubborn character anyway. He regretfully let him do his bidding, like a dour, rueful mother, observing a sullied, portly child feast freely on whatever they wished. It would have been a comical sight if it weren't for the fact that Mr. Hollander's utter dearth of table manners was a problem for everyone involved. He splattered his food every which way, with some getting in the unfortunate faces of everyone else. He spit graciously when he talked. He outright refused to chew and swallow prior to speaking. He slammed his fists on the table as a gesture of rage, excitement, concurrence, or simply as a pretext for letting out some percolating anger that dwelt within him. He interrupted others without remorse or even knowledge that he had done so, and the contents of what he said were no less significant than the food he spewed out so boorishly. As it turned out, as the dinner progressed, the opening in the back of Mr. Hollander's torso area had sealed up without even one pocket of air left. Within 5 minutes, it doubled in size. At this point, Cameron watched silently in astonishment, but could not hide the slight degree of entertainment he got out of the scene. "Save some for the rest of us, you hound," Mr. Tiberias shouted. It seemed that although he most certainly objected to Mr. Hollander's unspeakable behavior, he took some peripheral amusement from the whole tide of events. Mr. Hollander had been breaking up a wishbone and began mimicking a fiddle with it while singing an operatic tune. Despite his loquacity and tactlessness, Mr. Hollander had a rather pleasant-sounding lyric, baritone singing voice. That was, of course, when he wasn't stuffing his face full of food. The whole image left Mr. Tiberias in tears of laughter. "Oh, you rascal! You may be a dog of a man or no dog at all, but a beast, but you certainly can entertain," Mr. Tiberias said through an overpowering cackle as he tried to regain control of himself. "That is my job, to entertain," boomed Mr. Hollander, who was now taking the curtains and wrapping them around himself like an ersatz bridesmaid dress before prancing around coquettishly as if to imitate a wedding dance. "Oh, stop it! You're ruining the perfectly good curtains," shouted Mr. Tiberias, his laughter subsiding. At this point, Mr. Hollander grabbed a shawl, wrapped it around his meaty, plump head, and located a melon, which he shrouded in curtains and bobbed about and even kissed it. It was obvious he was mimicking the image of a Madonna in child. This particular action led Mr. Tiberias to drop his humorous, blasé attitude and react bitterly. However, for a moment, he was visibly startled by the scene. "Enough already. Put down my belongings and get out of my home," Mr. Tiberias demanded, puffing out his chest as much as he could. "What's it to you? This place is as much mine as it is yours," Mr. Hollander said, stopping in the middle of his play acting. The melon thudded on the floor. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Tiberias, his tone becoming sour. "I thought that was the agreement, if I'm not mistaken. This summer house is supposed to be half mine. My name is in the contract. Don't you remember? Didn't you read it?" Mr. Hollander challenged him, his voice becoming less brash but still demanding. "I never recall assenting to such a thing. This home is mine and mine alone." "What nonsense! To share a house with a buffoon, good-for-nothing court jester like yourself. What a joke!" Mr. Tiberias spat this out spitefully, folding his arms in disrepute. "What kind of friend are you?" came rumbling from Mr. Hollander so powerfully that the table, all its glasses and silverware shook. "You call people friends, but then you turn around and insult them to their face and abandon them behind their backs. That's what you did to Mr. Spencer. You left him in that damn sewer to rot by himself. Some loyal friend you are. You seem to only be interested in being someone's friend when you can rob them of their lives and rob them in blind daylight. Highway robbery. That's what this is. You might as well have pickpocketed me, straight and simple. Oh, don't you go on telling me about friendship. I'm surprised you haven't lost your gourmandizing appetite at the word. It wasn't my idea to leave him behind. There were certain restrictions that came with our newfound freedom," Mr. Tiberias retorted with fire. "Keep spouting at me like a broken faucet without restrictions, laws, and theories, and over-intellectual effete matters that do nothing to help any of us," shouted Mr. Hollander, who got up from his seat and stood eye to eye with his adversary. At this point, one thing was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone: the ever-growing girth of Mr. Hollander's waist. "The issue at hand is not that it's overly intellectual, but that you are far too half-witted and insensate to understand it," said Mr. Tiberias, who began attempting to clean the mess up made by Mr. Hollander, though it appeared to be a pretext for not looking him in the face too long. Leave it be, you devil. I'll do whatever I want here. It's my house anyways," Mr. Hollander said, picking up his fork and knife, as if he had even been using them to begin with. "Is that so?" said Mr. Tiberias. "Well, on that note, show yourself out before I do forcibly." "Not on my watch. It's rude to kick out a guest when he's not finished his food yet," Mr. Hollander replied, and began ravenously stuffing his face, or should we say mouth, again, breaking apart bread and drinking wine straight from the bottle. "You sick fiend. When will you stop tormenting us with your boorish antics? You're one to lecture us on rudeness. You're the paragon of incivility. You're the very concept of barbarism incarnate. Now put down that bottle. It's tremendously expensive. It has no place being imbibed by simians with no table manners." But Mr. Tiberias's broadsides were of no use. Mr. Hollander kept obstinately devouring his food as if it were some challenge he took great joy in, and even exerted himself purposefully to up the ante and disrupt Mr. Tiberias's status quo. "I didn't invite you so you could take every possible crumb I have left in this house. I brought you here for a reasonable, mature discussion, but it seems you're incapable of that." Mr. Tiberias was irate now, but it didn't look as if Mr. Hollander had even heard him, as he was too involved with his own food to even sense what was occurring around him. And it was like he had put cotton wool in his ears. Eventually, his clothes began to suffer the strain of his expanding girth. His belt buckle shot off and whirred through the dining room, like a projectile out of a musket that landed in the pantry, causing a juddering clang. Mr. Tiberias and Cameron watched in awe as he tripled in size, and gas began to escape from every orifice and cavity of his body. His nose, ears, eyes, and especially mouth began to swell immensely, with steam buzzing out of him, and finally his garments began to rip off. After protuberantly bulging to a mammoth size that began to shatter the ceiling lights and chandelier above him, he exploded dismally like an artillery shell or a celebratory firework, and bits of food, indigestion, hair, and other elements of the body were strewn about him. They were even on the windows, kitchen table, and fireplace. Nobody knew how to handle the situation. Cameron and Mr. Tiberias simply looked on in utter bewilderment for what felt like hours. The inscriptions on the clock were enveloped in little bits of what looked like vomit. After considerable hesitation, Cameron reached for a nearby broom, but Mr. Tiberias raised his hand to stop him. Finally, Cameron asked, "Is he done for? Is there any hope of reviving him?" He didn't know if this was the proper question to ask, seeing Mr. Hollander's numerous remains strewn about the house.
"Why would you want to do such a thing? This is the quietest I've ever seen him,"
Mr. Tiberias responded sardonically.
"Truthfully, we could gather up what little is left of him, assemble him back together, and mail him back to the dead letters post that Mr. Spencer was stationed at, and he can have a go at sending him off to the proper repair workshop of his immediate restoration. Well, to be more frank than glib, his eventual restoration. It will take at least a few months, and time slows down indefinitely at dead letters office. There's no telling when he'll be back. It could be years. Fingers crossed, he'll never see us again. I sent a pinky finger to be bandaged up and made anew, and it took 5 months. Universal Standard Time. Perhaps they'll station him elsewhere, but there is no guarantee.
So he just needs to wait for the proper people to work on him? Is it some kind of workshop where the physical and dream worlds are being repaired? How is that even possible? Cameron inquired, trying to avoid stepping in Mr. Hollander's fetid remains.
Have faith, my friend. Anything is possible given enough time and patience. These two traits go hand in hand, like melody and harmony. The universe is an infallible train of unstoppable force awaiting immovable objects. Within a few weeks, he'll have a new heart, intestines, and a liver. There's only one problem. He probably won't be quite the same. As his brain's lost consciousness, they'll have to contract a new one from scratch that is entirely indistinguishable from the old one. This is the challenge, but they have done it before. In fact, it takes the longest to grow a new brain. All those clumps of cells sitting in petri dishes for months on end are duplicating and gradually expanding. I hope he won't be as impetuous and dreadful next time. God willing, he'll have a much kinder spirit. But this business of reforming and transferring souls is tricky at best. I'll put a kind word in for the technicians.
Mr. Tiberias began to take on an expression of visible contrition as he gloomily strode outside into the garden adjacent to his home, and Cameron followed nearby. Mr. Tiberias spoke with a sudden, relaxed thoughtfulness.
I didn't want to take my methods that far, but the damn fool was asking for it. It reminds me of Jesus throwing the corrupt, venal, avaricious money changers out of the temple, if I may be so bold to make that parallel. You may well think that I am some kind of God-hater, that I have a deep, profound resentment for the Lord. But it's such figures that I actually look up to and garner wisdom from, more than I'd like to admit. The character of Christ is one of a mold of proper virtue and gracefulness by which everyone ought to fashion their lives. We may try, but we'll fail miserably. Just as a camel may try to pass through the eye of a needle. Humans are weak, fickle creatures, their eyes drawn in by lust, greed, and ambition. As you have clearly seen demonstrated here, we are akin to Plato's allegory in Phaedrus of men being led by a pack of wild dogs rather than by restraint and common sense. Now, it is only this silly, unrealistic idea that we ought to believe in a strict set of creeds and doctrinaire rules to be accepted into heaven. Heaven is here before our very eyes, and on earth. It is something attainable from within. Jesus, Mani, and the Buddha all spoke of an attainable, realistic version of truth and salvation that can address the fullest extent of humanity in all its wretchedness. It is not simply the pity Schopenhauer preached, but the fullest, maximum potential of our ethics. To place ourselves outside our egos in wholesome communion with the other, which the whole of Western continental philosophy has been so fixated on impugning. To amend the suffering inherent in mankind. Even Hegel used the word spirit so freely, and believed that the universe was destined toward gradual improvement. We cannot surmise a religion that forces the masses to say a prayer countless times over, confess and routinely perform good works. It's misleading. Heaven is a possibility that is now. It is insight, wisdom, clarity, and understanding. Not 5 Hail Marys and a rosary. It is potentiality, monads, the very top of the hierarchy of the best of all possible worlds. It refers to a Platonic, consistent value of good and lightness, which are far superior to knowledge shown as in the analogy of the sun in the divided line. It was the same when Schopenhauer named all his dogs Atman, because they represented a recurring Platonic form of the idea of a dog, resigned to a living proof of something far greater than you and I. So, now more than ever, religion, philosophy, the sciences need to address this primacy of human existence in its proceeding nature, not just emergent properties in the observable world. It must offer us deep insights about what it means to be something as opposed to nothing. That is what Dasein means, to exist within this world in relation to the objects within it. We must address this primordial essence of what it is to exist, truly and authentically, as the phenomenologists such as Heidegger or Bergson strove to do. Yet even Einstein paid homage to these maverick thinkers. Pure logic and reductivist nonsense can only get us so far. How many meaningful lives are led by the strict teachings of fully logical systems like those of John Stuart Mill, Francis Bacon, or Henry Sidgwick? It leads inevitably toward emptiness and an unsatiated hunger. We become like Mr. Hollander with his unbound greediness. These are truths, deeply profound ones that cannot be articulated properly. There is something eternal burning within us all, a desire for growth, a betterment, and an arc towards the light. Look within. The seeds of eternity are inside your very being. God is simply the highest order of the universe, the Suman Illud. The monastic cloisters echo this tune. The Tibetan monks brim with it. The Jesuit priests tremble with fear at the majesty of belief. It all derives from this inner, most fundamental aspect of what it means to be both human and to have faith. It's not something toward which we must strive laboriously. It's not a string we must fine-tune. We are all in the same pattern and on the same wavelength. We simply need to take the blinders off. Logical propositions won't guide us toward love. We must not be overly curious or unflappably of sound mind. As Wittgenstein said, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. He preached with such alacrity, nearly on the verge of shouting, and hopped up and down so madly that Cameron was at a complete loss of how to deal with him. He simply stared dumbfoundedly. So I guess my question is, Mr. Tiberias, are you a religious person? Would you consider yourself someone who believes in God? Cameron asked, hesitantly, not knowing what type of metaphysical can of worms he might open this time. It is an immensely complicated inquiry you have, friend. I would say that the God of my belief is not a supernatural, metaphysical deity that dwells outside time and both observes and interacts with the universe. God is an embodiment of transcendence and a higher calling as posited in the pantheistic or even panentheistic, with the former being preferred by Spinoza, the latter being discerned by Hegel. I have admittedly resigned myself to teasing humorous platitudes such as, one cannot know God without first knowing the devil, but I think such statements limit the potential of religion, a state of mind, and eudaimonia. Many years ago, I was visiting a Lutheran church in Bern, when I heard the most mellifluous, wondrous melodies escaping from the interior of the Church of the Holy Ghost, a Reformed church, and I felt myself implacably drawn to them. I felt something otherworldly move within and around me. Despite no formal repentance or remission of sins, I felt whole again. There was some kind of spiritual transaction that occurred that Sunday morning, and I felt the deepest recesses within my whole being quake with both joyous fear and elegiac trepidation, as the choir performed the most beauteous version of Allegri's Miserere me Deus I have ever heard. The euphonious, immaculate Platonic order of heavenly realms made itself visible or audible, even if just for a fleeting moment. These choir boys spoke to my soul, not with profane, futile words, but sweet antiphons in ancient Latin, the sounds and key one imagines angels to sing in, free from form and constraints of this modern, logical, callous, avaricious world. From the lectern spoke not an impostor, but a man of his word and of God's. From that moment on, it felt as if faith and belief was something I simply breathed and lived without effort. It was pure being toward God that encapsulated me, as if I were included in this vast mural where I am painted with thoughtful touch by the Creator himself. Though it seems nigh impossible to get myself into that state anymore, to drop my ego without pretensions or judgments, for only a moment, and garner a glimpse of the deific heavenly realms via spirits on earth. He spoke neither condemnation or creed, but the parables of Jesus, which were meant to be adopted here and now, for reformation, not damnation. From then on, I kept the idea of God in my front pocket at all times, so to speak, and I refused to fully throw him out now. His glowing, promising magnetism of hope never ceases to amaze me, and I find myself, time and time again, driven to the image of Christ, the body of the dead Christ in the tomb by Hans Holbein, to be precise. I felt a chasm of light and darkness split within me, each vowed for dominion over the other, until finally the light won. That day, I encountered a poor, abject man in the street and gave him everything I had on me. I made a promise to God that if he existed, I would not wager, as Pascal did, on believing in him, based solely on fear of losing my life in eternity, but I would actively live out the Gospels like Tolstoy did, rather than stubbornly holding on to my worldly possessions. What good does a coat do me when this man here has no place to call his home? I asked myself. Then I had a sudden feeling of Satori. There is such a place as God's home, and everyone dwells in it. The current world we occupy is a damaged, hopeless one, but we can offer what little we can to show compassion for the downtrodden and faith for the faithless. I didn't even have to convince myself to do it. I simply felt compelled, as if some greater power was acting through me, and I was merely a pawn. The more I traverse through this strange life, the more I'm convinced that free will is a myth, and that mankind has only the diabolical causal hands of the universe to guide them, like puppets in this idle parade of illusion. After finishing his speech, Mr. Tiberias plopped down on a nearby stone, withdrew his pipe from his pocket and began to light it, and looked on reflectively. Following about a minute lost in thought and trying to find the right words, Cameron replied, tugging at his collar agitatedly, "I'm very confused. What exactly are you? You claim to be an ethical hedonist and a Epicurean on one occasion, and the next moment you tell me of religious Christian epiphany and then go off on semi-atheistic ideologies in Marx and Hegel. I admit that I'm clearly not as well versed in scholarly matters as you, but you act as though you believe all these things at once. There has to be at least one idea that you hold on to that's true, right?" Cameron had a distressed, flummoxed expression, knowing that if he didn't formulate his arguments in the clearest manner possible, it would get lost in Mr. Tiberias's tangents. Mr. Tiberias sighed with a breath of slight disappointment, as if Cameron was a small child who hadn't paid attention. "Listen, my dear friend. None of this is about having a clear, concise answer to everything. Yes, I am a man of many faces, but I remain consistent in my inconsistency. You can write me off as insane all you like, but it is those who tick, ruminate, have hundreds of pestering voices within themselves that are the most interesting of all. In fact, those who are incarnate in constricting asylums ought to be freed and allowed back in the streets. There is so much one can learn from the mentally unstable, as society at large has cruelly deemed them. I once spoke to a schizophrenic fellow with some bipolar traits, who is middle-aged, quite open and talkative, and we had the most insightful discourse on subjects as obscure as naval history, art, literature, and even lepidopterology. Certainly, he was a bit rough around the edges, and a diamond in the rough, but he had a heart of gold, and could still offer so much value to society if only they knew how to treat him. What does it matter if authorities claim him insane? It is in truth those who have lost their wits and wish to keep everyone who lives, breathes, and creates as individuals with certain eccentricities, untouchable lepers or madmen whose faults are blown out of proportion in order to exact control over the populace. They fear them because they have insights into the so-called sane would never dream of having. They hold treasure troves of untapped wisdom and genius brimming out of their fertile minds. My point is that it doesn't matter if I exhibited to you one perfected version of truth that makes you comfortable. I dare say that I have done the opposite. My job is not to tell sweet, soporific lies to quell the sting of life, but to pour alcohol over the wound and force you to look at it in its brutish, engorged, ugly eye of a pimple and confront its very essence. We are meant to adapt, to acquaint ourselves with a myriad of challenges, be they intellectually or naturalistically primal. You must understand that life cannot be interpreted in only one mode. Leave it to the dogmatists to etch in stone the laws of nature, either governed by God or science, and for them to compete so blindly for what is right. Truth must be viewed through a different lens, one that is sometimes marred, blurred, or even blocked. Even a blind man can adjust and acquire a better sense of reality than those who see. What have I told you so many times? I can see exceedingly well. At this point, Mr. Tiberias's words started to dissolve into incoherent noise as the tenuous grasp Cameron had on the verisimilitude of events began to loosen up till he slipped out of it completely, and found himself to be not in his bedroom where he had fallen asleep, but the couch of his living room.
What had happened between the time he went to bed and when he awoke? He wasn't entirely certain, but he definitely did not want to add somnambulist to the list of conditions he was suffering from. It was about 4:30 in the morning, and he had just one day left before returning to work. He reckoned he would get about 2 or 3 more hours of sleep, then proceed with his day. It felt odd to have no stringent routine to keep him busy. Knowing the temptation of indolence lay near, he opted to run errands such as shopping and exercising to keep his mind and body well adjusted. He was aware, especially since Dr. Egan's warning, that he wasn't maintaining a proper diet with enough exercise, so he began making a point of buying a surplus of already prepared food to make the habit of eating less time-consuming. After all, part of the reason he neglected eating or drinking was precisely because it often took so long to go to the trouble of preparing meals. Despite this, Cameron felt himself gradually regaining control over his life. The real world made sense, so much so that it was painful to accept. Mr. Tiberias and his world made no sense, yet it was in many ways more enthralling than reality could ever dream of being.